Alrighty, let's get started. So, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to host Andrés Guilarte tonight and give him a platform to tell all of you his story. So, thank you all for joining. A little background information. Andrés is a political activist and he currently lives in Washington, D.C. The Fund for American Studies has sent him traveling across the United States on a campus tour over the last 11 months to present and talk to college students about the dangers of socialism. So I reached out to TFAS and requested Andres to speak with us because I'm the host of the Atlas Society Book Club, and we are currently reading The Case Against Socialism by Senator Rand Paul. And we're getting together to discuss the book in just 2 weeks. So I thought this would be a really great opportunity to hear his firsthand experience in Venezuela. So I just want to remind everyone to please submit your questions in the Q&A section, and we will get to them after he's done presenting. So without further ado, take it away.
Thank you so much, Anna. And well, thank you everyone for joining this webinar. Like Anna said, I mean, since you're reading or you already read the book, The Case Against Socialism from Rand, I mean, Venezuela is probably the best case nowadays against socialism in real practice. So just to expand a little bit about what we're doing with TFAS, with the Fund for American Studies, is that, well, since last year when all this like since around July, when we were seeing that in the US, there were more and more young people in universities were reaching out to these ideas of socialism. Well, the Fund for American Studies came out with this project called Venezuela Project, where my friend Jorge and I, we shared a presentation with young students in college campuses. I'm in charge of the east part of the country, and Jorge Galicia of the west part of the country. Due to the coronavirus, we have to expand the project, now doing it online. But we went to a lot of college campuses and communities telling this same story that I'm about to tell you, telling people what actually socialism is, you know, what actually is going on in Venezuela. I mean, how a country that used to be so wealthy, so prosperous, I mean, people used to fly a lot, travel a lot to Venezuela as a tourist place. I mean, and the memories I had when I was a child, how do we end up in the place where we are right now? So without further ado, let me start with a simple question. Have you ever been between a rock and a hard place? Something where both outcomes seem equally terrible. And it's a place where you can have never imagined that you will be in your life. Well, here's a time when I did. This is April 19, 2017. One of the biggest protests in Venezuelan history, and I was right in the middle of it. We were getting tear gas from the police officers and bullets, and not just rubber bullets, all kinds of bullets. And also, we have to make a choice. We confront the police in full riot gear, or we go through the river you saw in the video, and the one you see in these both pictures. My situation was just like the one in the left picture. We were surrounded by the police officers in the top of us, and at the right was this river. In Venezuela, that river is known to be anything less than an actual river. It's actually an open sewer that goes all the way through the heart of Caracas. And you can't imagine the amount of diseases that you can get by only touching that water. I mean, I saw all kinds of people going through that. I mean, small children, old people, families trying to escape the gas from the police officer and the bullets. What did I do that day? I'm gonna tell you later. My name is Andrés Guilarte. I'm a 25-year-old Venezuelan political activist. I only have 1.5 years here in the US. So if you can remember what happened last year, that Venezuela was all over the news around the world, here's a video clip that is going to refresh your memory.
News in our world lead, Venezuela may be on the brink of no return right now.
This is what it's come to in Venezuela. Emergency surgery by flashlight.
A massive shortage of food and aid in the country is leaving thousands of Venezuelans literally fighting for their lives.
when this was happening last year, as you know, it was in all headlines of newspaper. Everyone was knowing what happened in Venezuela. But I can tell you, it goes way beyond just headlines in papers and in media. It actually affects real people in real ways. For example, my mom. You know, last year the blackouts in Venezuela were something out of this world. Usually, since many years ago, we had to get used in Venezuela that you don't have maybe for 1 hour, 2 hours, maybe one day without electricity. But last year, around March, there were almost 7 days without any electricity, 90% of the country. So you can imagine that all public services in the hospitals, like you saw in the video, people were doing surgeries with flashlights for the cell phones. I mean, it was a complete chaos. And I received desperate calls from my mom telling me that, well, all the food that she gathered for maybe 1 week and a half, it all spoiled because there was no electricity to maintain the refrigerators. Well, it was a terrible situation that thousands of families had to go through last year. And it's still in their minds. I mean, every time that I get message of friends and family telling me that, hey, the light just went out. They are prepared just in case that maybe they're going to face another week without any power. And that's something that no one has to go through. And also, when you are in those kind of situations, you have to recur to abilities that you never know you have to. For example, know how to use an oil lamp, a gas lamp, small survival skills that you usually think that is something just of, TV. But in Venezuela, they take you down a road where you need these skills because the usual, things that people in other countries take for granted as, basic the services, basic things. We don't have that in Venezuela. So you have to understand that the situation is really worse than is pictured in the media. And this is one of the key factors that had led the Venezuelan migration crisis to be the worst in the region and the second worst right now in the world, only behind the Syrian crisis. When we started this project last year around July, the number right there was like over 4.5 million Venezuelans that already left the country. When we started this year, the latest report from the United Nations said that if the situation gets worse, or even if it continues at the ways it is, we will have over 6 million Venezuelans leaving the country. That, at least in numbers, overpassed the Syrian refugee crisis. Of course, it's completely different backgrounds, but in numbers, it will overpass it if it continues as bad as it is. And the pandemic had only got things worse inside the country. And where is everyone going? I mean, everyone they can. People is just waking up one day, telling their children, leave everything you have, take a couple of shoes, maybe a couple of toys, and we are leaving the country. And they're going to Colombia, to Peru, to Chile, to Argentina, walking on foot for weeks. There is even cases of people who have made all their way to the US southern border. There is an old saying in politics that what government can deliver results, well, people vote with their feet. And that's what summarized the migration crisis in Venezuela. And to speak a little bit about, how was my life over there? Well, I lived my whole life in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela. And living in that building that you see later right there. The building is part of El Llanito, and El Llanito is part of Petare. Petare is the biggest district in Venezuela, and it's also the biggest barrio in Latin America, one of the most dangerous places in the world. So you have to make, get used to things like, for example, every single night you will hear a shooting, and not just regular shootings, like using machine guns, because these guys that operate in the barrio, they have really powerful weapons. And one of the biggest hospitals of Caracas was just behind my building. So you had to get used to all of that, hearing the sirens from the police officers, from the ambulance, from shooting. It was a really terrible place for a child to grow up. But even in that context, I mean, usually people find ways to achieve themselves. So thankfully, I was able to go to the biggest university in Venezuela, the Central University of Venezuela, where I graduated in 2018 with a bachelor's degree in international relations. So during my 4 years in the university, I was able to join several groups. I joined Students for Liberty chapter in the country. I joined a political party known as Venezuela, which is the only one that openly speaks about capitalism in the country. and several other groups. But more importantly, I was able to join the political movement against Maduro, the students' movement against them, against the regime. And that led me to be elected as the president of my student government. And while I was, exercising the role of the president of the school, you have to get used to know a lot of stories of students. And now that I'm outside the country, I can understand that the difference from studying in Venezuela and studying here in the US is not that quite different. I mean, you have to get used to stay late to study a lot for a lot of exams, meet deadlines of papers, read several books. I mean, it's the usual stress you have from college. But now, just close your eye for a second and imagine that you're in the middle of your history class and suddenly you start crying and choking. And it's not because the professor is really bad. Actually, it is because there is literally tear gas coming from the window, because the government is just throwing it inside the campus because they hate students, especially those who openly speak against the government. So it was something really common that you have to stop the class and go along with your professor to the street and start protesting. I mean, that was something really, really common, especially in 2017, which was the biggest year of protests in history of Venezuela. So you can see me in the middle picture with my green scarf, in the right one holding the flag of university. That was something every single day. And since I was part of the student government, we had to organize the students that went to these protests. So like gathering all the information about them, making sure that follow escape routes so they can reach their houses, having all the equipment that you need against the tear gas, against all the bullets that they gave you. You have to prepare yourself and believe that you were some kind of warrior against this regime in order to survive in this protest. But even in that situation, it was common to see people falling. People, because the tear gas that they use in Venezuela is not regular tear gas, it's expired tear gas because it's more deadly. And they do that, of course, in purpose. So there is a sum of things that make studying in Venezuela really hard. And if that it wasn't enough, when you go out, well, maybe you won't go back to your house in Venezuela. You won't see your mom, your family again. When it was common to see students, many of my friends, I was really lucky to never be picked in one of those protests by the government. But a lot of people didn't have the same luck. That number you see right there, that's the latest number from our organization inside Venezuela that follow-ups the number of people that have been detained by the regime. So they are political prisoners, just people that don't agree with the regime, so they are being held without any due process. It's like a kidnap. They just pick you in the street inside your house. There is no due process. They can beat you, torture to try to get information of just because they're a bunch of sadistic individuals. They actually, it's like a kidnap because there is many cases where they pick you and they actually ask for your family for money in order to release you, or they use you as a exchange currency so they can make pressure on political parties or of organizations. So in summarize, they don't care about your life if you get caught. So there is many cases in Venezuela about that. And that number usually fluctuates between weeks. You may have more, you may have less, but there is always political prisoners inside Venezuela. So going back what I showed you in the beginning of the presentation, April 19, 2017, what did I did that day? Well, I was really lucky because we saw an opening when the police officers were walking and marching down the highway. We saw an opening behind them. So we just ran behind them towards some buildings and hide for hours. But not everyone gets that lucky. A lot of people have to go through the sewer. A lot of people got arrested by the regime officers. But it's a situation where you think you have power of choice, but you don't. Because like I was telling you in that moment, you either pick the sewer or you pick the police officers. And honestly, when I was in that situation, I was no way in error that I was going through the sewer. I mean, I was already thinking who I was going to call when I get arrested because there was just no way I was going through the sewer. But thankfully, I didn't have to. But when you go down that road, when you don't actually have choices, when the choices come from an external power and they're forcing you to pick among them, you are no longer an individual. You become just a subject of the power that is controlling you. That's what a lot of people had to go through Venezuela, and they're still under that control. So if it wasn't enough to have the military against you, the police officers, the intelligence service, you also have your own neighborhoods, because that's what colectivos are. So these guys are like a local mafia group. They live with you in the district. So depending on the size of the district, you may have 1, 2, 3, 4, X number. In Petare, my district where I used to live, since it's the biggest one, you have many of these guys. And they're more prepared than even the police officers. They have more weapons that they do. So the main issue with these guys is that the government protects them. They say that they are like a peace group. They are neighbors to operate in the district, so they can make sure that all social programs arrive to every single family and, protect the neighborhood against whatever terrorist attack that they think in their mind that is going to happen. But in reality, what they do is to control the neighborhoods. So these pictures you see right here, I took them from the balcony of my house in May in 2017. So we were protesting my neighbors, and the military came up with the police officers and with these guys, and they start shooting everyone. We find a way that I go back to my apartment. I went with my family in the apartment, and they started shooting the buildings. So in my room in my house in Venezuela, I still have the bullets holes inside my room, in the floor and in the wall, because they were just shooting everyone. And they actually made a threat that they will burn down our buildings if we didn't stop protesting, especially the buildings that house the students. Why do they use the word students? Because I know those guys. I went to high school with many of them, which, by the way, the high school is the building right behind them in the middle picture. And the guy with the white shirt, he also sells vegetables in the same street where I used to live, and he's the head of the colectivo. So it was really common that maybe one day of the week, my mom used to tell me, go buy some vegetables to this guy. And I went to his location and buy some onions, some lettuce. And at night, well, he could be robbing at you, shooting at you, trying to kidnap you, or doing whatever he can to control you through terror. So that's how they operate. They know everyone who lives in the building, in the neighborhood. They operate as an intelligence group, so they tell the government who is who and what they are doing with their lives. So they knew what I was doing. So after that day, I had to change the way I come back from the university or whatever to my house, because if you encounter these guys at night, there is no police to help you. They are the real police from the government. And of course, you can have weapons if you are a civilian. Only these guys can have weapons, because they are, as like I told you, a peace group from the government. So when I graduated in 2019 from the university, after all this was happening, one of my best friends told me, why don't you apply for an internship in the US? I mean, for me, it was a really long shot, but I tried it. And I was selected to be part of the Cato Institute spring class last year. So I went to the airport with my mom in January of last year, and the left picture is the main airport of Caracas. There is no one in that part, and that is the international part of the airport. Venezuela used to be a tourist place. Everyone wanted to go, and people had the money to get out of Venezuela, but right now, no one wants to go, and no one can get out to the airport. So I was, really lucky to be able to go. And my mom, the beautiful lady you see in the right picture, she started crying a lot that day when I left. I told her, I'm just going to an internship in the US. It's going to be a few months, and I will be back to Venezuela. Because, I was not ready to live 25 years of life, my friends, my family, everything, for the completely unknown. I was not ready to make that decision. But my mom, she knew something. That moms always know better. And actually she did. Because just 1 week after I arrived, the political crisis in Venezuela just exploded to a new whole level. So Juan Guaido took power of the executive. Oh, he's trying to do that. How did it happen? Well, in the Congress in Venezuela is called the National Assembly. So Guaido was the head of the National Assembly. He still is the head of the National Assembly. And in 2019, Maduro committed fraud in presidential elections. So no one recognized Maduro inside the country and outside the country. So when the time came last year to, take the power of the executive of whoever won the elections, since no one recognized Maduro turnout, well, it was in the responsibility of the head of the National Assembly to be in charge of the executive until new elections came up. And we are still waiting, not only for the new elections, but for Maduro to leave power. And that's the struggle that has been going on since last year. And I was in the internship, everything was going around Venezuelan's news. But eventually the internship had to end. So I had to make a choice again, a forced choice, because if I went back to Venezuela, there was already the risk of these guys trying to do something against me, because while I was here doing the internship, they went to my building looking for me because they knew I was not around anymore. So they were asking, where is Andres, where he's going, and my mom was always lying, telling them that he's anywhere else but the US, because when you come from the US to Venezuela, and especially if you're a young student, they hate you right away. They think that you're a terrorist. And if you come from Cato Institute, the Cato Institute is labeled as a terrorist organization by the regime. So in simple terms, I was a terrorist to the eyes of these guys. So it was going to be really common that I entered the airport and they will see where I was coming from, and they told me go to that room, and I will stay in that room for the rest of my life. So that was not a choice of going back and put my life at risk. And also the economic crisis. When I was making the calculations last year, what I could make here, just working 2 weeks with minimum wage, will be the equivalent of working for months in Venezuela, even with my college degree. So what I make here goes specifically to my family that is in Venezuela, and that's the same thing that the millions of people that are outside the country are trying to do to help their families that are inside. So the decision was crystal clear. I applied for the asylum option, which I'm waiting for that. So how was Venezuela before all of this? We're always, the country that you saw in the news? Actually, no. We used to be one of the prosperous countries in Latin America and in the world. Venezuela discovered the biggest oil reserves in the last century, in the beginning of the last century. So we went from a rural country to a more industrialized one. And after the fall of the dictator in 1958, yes, we used to have a dictatorship even before this one. The main political powers of that moment signed an agreement to actually settle the ground rules for the upcoming democracy. And actually worked for a few years. By 1970, Venezuela had become the richest country in Latin America and one of the 20 richest countries in the world. Just to speak about the GDP per capita, it was higher than the one of Spain, Greece, and Israel, and only 13% lower than the one of the UK. Again, the same country that I showed in the previous videos used to be like this. We were used to know as the Saudi Venezuela because Venezuela was a really rich country. And to speak about an actual example, my mom, the beautiful lady again that you see in all these pictures, she was born in the mid-60s, but she never finished high school. So she didn't have formal education. My sister, the girl you see in the left picture, she was born in the mid-80s. And the ugly children she's carrying, that was me, that I was born in the mid-90s. So we didn't knew our fathers. We had separate fathers and we never knew them. So my mom was a single mom without formal education, with 2 children, but even in that context, she was able to find a pretty good job to maintain the whole family. And we had a classic middle-class family. That's how good Venezuela used to be at that point. We always have food on our tables, presents under the Christmas tree. My mom used to dress me as a rhino, which is the costume you see in the left. A lot of people think it's a unicorn, but actually it's a rhino. It was a pretty good childhood. But for a moment, I make the mental exercise. What will happen if I were born today in Venezuela, under the same circumstances, with a mom without formal education, no father, but in this crisis? Well, something like this, where you can see that a mom is unable to feed her own son. With the latest report from the COVID project, we follow up the crisis in Venezuela that came out just July last month. They said that the crisis has gone so far that we have 96% of the population living in poverty and 79% living under extreme poverty. What does that mean? That 79% cannot afford to eat the 2,200 daily calories that they should. So it's a situation where you have to be grateful. I'm grateful that I didn't have to spend my childhood under these circumstances. And when you're a child and probably happened to a lot of you guys is that when you don't want to finish your meal, your mom, your father, whoever used to tell you like, you should finish it because you never know who else in the world doesn't have the same opportunity that you do to have that whole meal. And you know, you have a moral dilemma and you end up eating your food. But right now, today, when I have a little cousin living in Venezuela, when she doesn't want to finish her food, they don't tell the tale anymore. They just tell her, go and open up the window. What she's going to see is the same thing that I saw every single day when I went to the university. People eating garbage on the street. In my way to the university, I used to saw lines of people in a restaurant, but not in the front line, in the back line, in the back door, because they knew the schedule of the restaurants and when they were going to throw the garbage out. So they wanted to be the first in lines to eat garbage. That's not life. That's way below what human dignity is. But that is going on right now. And these people, I mean, they used to be, you know, a middle class people, a lot of them. But they're going on through the worst humanitarian crisis that this region has seen in its history. And again, that attack on human dignity, that attack on your identity, because when you don't have dignity, you no longer have identity. You no longer are actually an individual, because all your choices, all what you do in your life is controlled by someone else. So that's going on right now in Venezuela. It's terrible because a lot of people actually don't know how bad the situation is. So how everything just fit into place, how that happened, how the richest country in Latin America end up with their citizens eating garbage in the street. There is a number of key factors that the governments before Hugo Chavez did in order to allow this guy to reach power. I mean, who was Hugo Chavez in the end? When you read the biographies of Hugo Chavez by actual people, not the fans of Hugo Chavez, by actual journalists, Hugo Chavez was a failure in his military career, but he was a really charismatic guy. He could sell you whatever he wanted. So this guy, you know, maybe doesn't appear in every single other country, but if governments made the same mistakes that were made in Venezuela and leave a window to be open as to allow something as close to Chavez to appear, we're going to have a big trouble in our hands. So what were these mistakes? The first one was the nationalization of the oil industry back in 1976. In these years, the government, through a campaign of nationalistic views, protectionist views, that they say like, well, if oil is in our lands, we should get all the profits through the state. So we're going to buy the whole industry from foreign companies and just keep it with the Venezuelan people. So they had this speech that, well, if it's on our land, the profits should go to the citizens. Of course, that never happens. And during these years, the Yom Kippur War was going on in the world. So the oil prices all went up. What happened? Well, the government received billions of dollars. And what did they do with that money? Well, they created a lot of social programs, which, by the way, many of those social programs were great in paper. And in practice, some of them were. But they were not sustainable in the long run. Another thing that they did was creating a lot of fictional jobs directly paid by the government. And they started creating a lot of, you know, infrastructure and a lot of stuff. But eventually, oil prices went down. And when that happened, the public debt went up. And the governments at that moment didn't want to stop the expanding. So they engaged in external debt and printing of money. What happens when you print money? Inflation happens. What is inflation in simple terms? Just imagine that the economy is a really tall building. Your salary takes the stairs, but the prices take the elevator. That's how despair an economy is under inflation. And we used to have inflation before even Hugo Chavez was in power. And people didn't like it, what was going on with the economy in those years, in the late 80s. So they started pointing fingers at who? Well, at the politicians. And they were right about that. Blaming the ones in power, blaming the ones that they thought that they could control the society better than their own citizens. But the main problem was that even that everyone knew that the problem were the politicians and the state, they were still demanding their social benefits. And the government was still delivering them. Because already a culture of dependency was established in the society. Not as big as it is right now, but it was starting to grow and grow. And that was happening before Chavez. So a government in the late 80s actually realized we have to do something about this. So they created this economic package known as the Great Term, which in simple terms, again, was just to cut down the spending and open up the market to foreign companies, open up the markets to local entrepreneurs, just open the economy. And one of the key measures that they were going to take is to increase the price of some necessities. For example, gasoline. It was just going to go up a few cents, just a few cents. But after the first day that that measure was enacted, there were riots all over Caracas. I mean, people didn't like it, that the price of the gasoline went up. And of course, also the price of public transport went up like the price of gasoline, because they are connected. So people didn't like that. So they went to the street, they riot in over Caracas, the government had to release the military, and many people died. Even till this day, we still don't know the exact number of how many people died. But there is something that they don't tell people in history classes that the government owns and controls, is that this was not an spontaneous movement. It was something that was being worked through in the inside of Venezuelan society since the late 60s. After the Cuban Revolution, when Castro went to Venezuela, he explicitly said that Venezuela was the aim of the revolution, that Venezuela was the next step to expand the revolution in the region. So in the late 60s and till the mid 70s, we have a problem with the guerrillas in Venezuela. These guerrillas, I mean, they were defeated, but the government made a huge mistake, that it was to pardon everyone. They made an amnesty. So they allowed the combatants of the guerrilla to be reinserted in the society. So they started infiltrating in many parts of the country, into the academy, into the universities, and especially inside the military. So when Chavez tried a coup d'etat in 1992 as an excuse because of the riots in Caracas and everything, he said that, you know, order has to be reestablished in Venezuela. But but not just something spontaneous. He was eventually the product of this movement that was being working inside the military. So Chavez was just a product of that movement. But he failed that day. Even though that he failed, the government gave him a national interview. So they wanted him to say to the combatants of the coup d'etat, like, to stop fighting. But Chavez also took the opportunity to say to the country that this situation that Venezuela was going through with economic problems and everything was only for the moment. When Chavez pronounced those words, for the moment, a lot of people saw hope, you know, that maybe this guy was not that bad. Maybe he was doing the right thing by trying a coup against this government that was corrupt and everything. So a lot of people started to buy that idea that maybe eventually someone will come and help the society and fix the problems with corruption, the problems with inflation in the economy, and the violence that was starting to appear in the Venezuelan society in those years. So when Chavez was released in 1994 from prison, he stated that his flagship towards to gain the executive was to completely change the system. That's how he operated his whole campaign. And you know, he was right about that. The system had to change. There was too much power for the government, but not the way he actually changed it. When he won in 1998, he never said that he was a socialist. He actually said the opposite. Well, not the opposite, the middle ground. He said that he was not a capitalist or a socialist. He was a humanist, that he came from the poor people, therefore he wanted to help poor people, that he wanted to, you know, engage in foreign you know, foreign companies to come and bring money to Venezuela and, you know, protect individual liberties. When you see the interviews of Chavez in those years, you actually will say, like, what happened to that guy? Well, he actually knew what he was doing, just lying to the people. When he won, just 1 year after that happened, he completely changed the constitution through a legal process in the constitution of Venezuela. So he changed the name of the country. You used to have 2 chambers of Congress like you have in here. He changed it just to 1. He changed the way the oil industry was managed, the agricultural industry, the steel industry, everything that he could, just to fit the country to his actual socialist goals. And what were those goals? These ones. This is an actual footage of Chavez in 2006 in the middle of one of the biggest squares in Caracas. And he was pointing out towards some buildings and asking, who owns that building? Well, that's in public hands. That's great. Leave it like that. Who owns the other building? That's in private hands. Well, let's confiscate that. And people were happy, the followers of Chavez, because he was, doing what he was promising people, that he was going to take stuff from the elite because the capitalist elites were bad, the business owners were against people's will, so he had to take these people's money in order to give back to the people. But in reality, that never happened. I mean, we never actually saw what Chavez used to tell people, but they were not the only ones clapping Chavez, their followers. Chavez was actually like a superstar around the world in those years, especially here in the US. A lot of politicians of that time used to say that Venezuela paradise was being built and that, Chavez's model was a role model for the rest of the world. In all parts of the world, we saw people supporting Chavez while we were inside the country. He was confiscated all businesses, from top businesses to small businesses, attacking individual liberties, attacking the press, attacking many organizations. He stopped the main network of Venezuela to continue his work. He did everything he could to control the society through the years. And because of the Iraqi war, well, the oil prices went up again. And Chavez received just billions of dollars. What did he do with that money? The same thing that the government did in the 70s, creating more social programs. In Venezuela, we have a social program for everything that you need in your life. There is a social program for that. He created a lot of fictional jobs. He's starting to give free money to a lot of countries in the region. So that's how he created this network in Latin America. So he did everything he could just to keep spending. And the government entered this deficit till we are this today. He completely destroyed the industrial apparatus of Venezuela. So when he died in 2012, he selected Maduro as his successor, or that's what they told us. When he died, also the oil prices went down. Maduro, in 2013, he committed fraud in the presidential election. That's something validated by the own company that created the machines through we used to vote in Venezuela. But the opposition did nothing against that. They actually bought the idea that Maduro won the election. And Maduro wanted to continue the show that Chavez had implemented, but he no longer had the money. So he recurred to weapons in order to went from a culture of dependency to a culture of terror. Because that's how we are living today in Venezuela. He just, finding a way to blame someone else through what is happening in Venezuela. They usually blame the US and the imperialism and the capitalism and the Colombia, but everything that is going on today in Venezuela is because of Chavez's fault, and also because those who allowed Chavez to rise to power. So just to speak about a little bit about the US, when I arrived to this country last year, it was amazing. All the things that I saw. I mean, from the place where I came, all the things that I saw here, it was something for me that we only see in a movie. When I arrived because I arrived through New York, it was everything that I saw. It was just like living a movie, especially in a supermarket. When someone took me to the first supermarket here in the US, and I saw something like this. All kinds of toilet papers, brands, smells, size. It was crazy for me because I was used to something like this. That's the usual picture that you get in a supermarket in Venezuela, especially the supermarket that is near my house. A paper that says one per person. So you will have in your neighborhood a WhatsApp group. So you get a tip like, hey, toilet paper arrived to the supermarket, or sugar or flour, whatever. So you have to go with your mom, with your sister, with the dog, with the cat, with the neighbor, with your grandmother, with everyone. So each one of them can grab a package, and you can survive for a couple of weeks or whatever you can find. But here in the US, I didn't saw that. Of course, during the pandemic, I actually saw some flashback when I went to a supermarket here in DC, and I had to make a line. And when I entered, there were empty shelves. For a moment, I was like, well, all that I need is just a couple of shootings, and then I'm back in Caracas again. But I understand something really important, that when I went to the same supermarket the next day here in the US, it was all replenished. of course, you have to make the lines outside because that's part of the COVID measures, but the products, they were replenished. Because here in the US, what is going on with the pandemic is an external factor that is affecting the country. So you actually have a system of individual liberties and free market that can respond toward this crisis that is going on with the pandemic. But in Venezuela, it's the opposite. It's an internal crisis completely manufactured by the government, which is making it impossible for businesses to actually react to this crisis. So you will never see the same supermarket in Venezuela replenish its stock the next day. You will have to wait weeks for that. But that's the main difference between an internal crisis and an external crisis of what we're seeing right now with the pandemic. Some people say that it's like a taste of socialism, and in many ways it is, but it's also a reminder of the actually wonders of free markets. So when I hear a lot of politicians, especially here in the US, trying to advance in policies that is going to allow, more power to the government, and eventually, who knows, allow a system of control of prices like in Venezuela, which is a socialist policy, expropriating businesses by the state, controlling currencies, attacking individual liberties, attacking freedom of press, freedom of speech, everything. All those policies, all these politicians starts with goodwills, but eventually those goodwills just stand in paper. When I hear these people trying to advance that, I remind my family. This is the last picture I took with them in Christmas of 2018. When I remember the decision I had to take to stay here in the country, even though that I followed this wonderful opportunity with the Cato Institute, and right now I'm doing everything here with the work with the TFAS. When I made the choice of staying, I felt that I was again in a forced option, because if I went to Venezuela, I was going to be picked by the government officers. That's not an option. I mean, an option that is forcing you like that is not an option. So that is what socialism is in reality. It's an ideology that takes all the power from you as an individual, and it gives that to a couple of people inside the government, which are going to control society better than maybe you think you will do your own life. Because when you don't have choices, you're no longer individual, you don't have identity, and you don't have dignity. And that is what socialism is doing to my country, and what we want to prevent anywhere else. So when you hear all these politicians saying that there is a socialist paradise, let me tell you, there is no such paradise. In reality, it's a nightmare. So thank you so much for hearing this presentation. So I think we have some questions, right? And we can go straight with that.
Yes, we do have some questions. Thank you so much for sharing. That was incredible. Feel free to turn off your screen share if that's better for you, but up to you. So first question is, how dangerous is it to speak out against Maduro in Venezuela?
Well, I mean, you saw the PowerPoint. I mean, usually depends on the context and the city you're living. It may be way too dangerous, or it can be a little risk, but there is always a danger when you speak out. So it depends on what the government wants to do with you. If they see you as an actual threat, they're going to pick you up and send you to the prison. If you make some collectivo angry, they are going to pick you up and take you to prison, or even worse, they're going to kill you, or they're going to rob you, or they're going to like they do with a lot of businesses, they do these blackouts, or that they ask you for money in order to allow you to have your businesses. So it's like a tax from the collectivos on your business. So there's always a problem when you speak out against the regime. But it doesn't matter if you speak out, supporting capitalism or supporting whatever. If you speak out against whatever they're doing, there is always a danger that something may happen to you or your family. That's something that you have to understand when you are inside the country.
Mm-hmm. Are the collectivos and the government officials, they're working together, or they are working? Okay.
Yes, sure. Because one of the main purpose of the socialist ideology that Chavez implemented in the country is to create a new level of local government. So you have, here in the US, you have federal, state, and local, and he created another one below local, which is called comunas like in Paris. And these comunas, So they operate in every single district, and the colectivos are part of the comunas. So they are like a peace group from the comunas, and they are supported by the government. And well, if they have better weapons than the police officers, you may guess that they didn't get that, in a Walmart. Probably it's like the government helped them to get those weapons. And if there is completely impunity to what they can do, it's because the state judicial system doesn't care about what they are doing because they are protected by the government.
Yeah, interesting. What do you think are the political reasons why Venezuela stopped being relevant on the media if things hasn't gotten better?
Sure.
In local media, like United States media.
Yes, actually not just the United States. I mean, I think that worldwide, it's by that same question you can apply why no one else is speaking about Syria, for example, when the humanitarian crisis is still going on in Syria. Why is people not talking too much about Yemen when still there is a problem in the conflict with Yemen? Because that's media, that's news. I mean, news can be something today, can be something the day after, but eventually it will disappear and something else will become media until God knows what happens in Venezuela. Someone of higher profile gets killed or a new movement going on in Venezuela again. Then you will see that it will make again world news. But the main issue here is that just like news are today news and the next day they may not, in Venezuela, these problems, we have the problem with the socialism for many years. Chavismo is 20 years in power, but many people around the world are starting to see the crisis since last year, since what happened last year with the news. But like I told you, it has been happening for many years. I mean, the protests of 2016, the protests of 2014, of 2012, the problems 2009. For us, there is nothing new. If people is starting to learn that Maduro is a narco-terrorist, that's something that the world is starting to do, but we knew that in Venezuela for a long time. So the answer will be like, that's the essence of news. I mean, there is no moral or there is no, embodiment of news. Just news is just news. What could be today, tomorrow will not be news. And unfortunately, that's bad because, I mean, people are still suffering in all these countries, not just Venezuela, in all these countries. So if you want to know how to support them, if you want to know what is going on in these countries, you have to approach, local media of those countries or independent journalists to trying to find news. But, the main networks, if that doesn't is to, that is not really, it's going to make a huge headline. They're not going to say, for example, that last week we had 30 people making lines for 3 days to get a gallon of gasoline. That's horrible. That's going on in Venezuela, but that's not great headlines for newspapers.
Mm. Venezuela is recognized as a totalitarian socialist nation. So many socialists in the United States argue that democratic socialism is very different. But what do you think, given the implementation of democratic socialism set in motion, do you think that could become our fate?
And the actual problem is that not just here in the US, there is actually a majority in Venezuelan politicians that they argue that the problem in the regime is that they are criminals. Not that they are socialists, it's that they are criminals. They are completely ignoring the reality that they became criminals because socialism played the role toward that. I mean, socialism is an ideology, a system that allows criminals to flourish like he did in Venezuela. And everything started with Chavez winning a democratic election in 1998 through a democratic socialism. Of course, he changed the way he used to call it. Here in the US, you have representative democracy. In Venezuela, he used to say a participative democracy. So he wanted to change semantics in wars, but it's the same thing. Chavez arrived to power through a democratic elections. That's how most of them, with the exception, for example, of Cuba, that Castro arrived with the force in power, but most of them arrived through fair elections. And eventually they start doing the democratic way of socialism, which is just another way of communism. Like, I think it was Thatcher that used to say that socialism is just communism through the votes. I mean, that's what socialism is. Democratic socialism is going to end eventually in a totalitarianism, because when you give too much power to the government, they will, like Acton used to say, You know, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts. So imagine what is going to happen to a country that has, to a state like in Venezuela was, that had absolute power. They end up like the way they are right now.
Mm-hmm. Did Operation Gideon in May of 2020 delegitimize Guaido as a sovereign leader in the eyes of the Venezuelan people?
Well, Guaido is digitally, I mean, his image, I had troubles pronouncing that word, but his image is lower since last year. I mean, right now, through actual polls, independent polls, the approving numbers of Guaido is in the same level of Maduro, just a little bit higher, but almost the same level of Maduro. And that didn't only happen with that operation. It happened since last year. Since I will say since around April. There was in April 30 last year an attempt to overthrow Maduro. It completely failed. It was a complete failure. But I mean, with the pass of the months, this all motivation from Guaido, people were just starting to feel, you know, that he was not going to promise the things that he did, that he said he was going to do. And well, we have 1.5 years with Guaido trying to overthrow Maduro, and he's still trying to do that. I mean, and the crisis is just going worse and worse. Right now, Guaido is like a social media president. He doesn't leave Instagram or Facebook. And not because he actually doesn't want to, it's because he can't. He doesn't have the power of the institutions, unfortunately. And Operation Gideon, I mean, that was just another example of a failed attempt to overthrow Maduro, and it was worse failure than the one of last year. It was actually ridiculous. But well, that happened, and who knows what else is going to happen. But what we do know is that an actual strategy has to happen in order to overthrow these criminals.
Mm-hmm. So the next question, how does Maduro maintain power? I think that this is asking, you know, if there are other countries around Venezuela, why do they not step in?
Because Chavez used to have a really important factor that is still lasting till today. He came from the military. So he was part of the military. He was one of them. And when he started right to power, he started giving a lot of benefits to the militaries. And he started to erase the ones that were against him inside the institution. So he completely shaped the military institution around him. And he was seen, well, still to today, in the institution as the supreme leader of the military. So when you have the total support of the military, you ban you don't allow citizens to carry weapons. You also have the complete power of the intelligence service, of the other institution, of the judicial powers, of the police, and you have these colectivos. I mean, it doesn't matter how bad the economy seems to be, he still is in power because he has the weapons. And let's remember, the way that he finances the state gets money is through narcotics, the illegal mining of coal, and a lot of illicit actions that they're doing. So even if the economy is really bad, they find ways to get money in order to pay all the favors that they have inside the military.
What similarities do you see between Maduro's regime and the U.S. Administration, the current U.S. administration?
The current well, I mean, you can't compare a totalitarian socialist regime with the democratic administration that we have in the U.S. I mean, like I said in the presentation, Maduro shouldn't be in power. He committed fraud in 2013, so he actually has never been the actual president of Venezuela. So I mean, just in understanding that factor and how all the institution has been kidnapped by the regime. I mean, institutionally, there is no comparison of the crisis that is going on today in Venezuela to what is going on right now in the US. But I will say that there are some similarities among the society narrative of what it was, for example, in the 2000s in Venezuela, or even before Chavez. I think that one of the biggest problems that is going on in the society right now is like the division that is going on. I mean, when Chavez get to power, remember, Chavez was an outsider of the establishment. So the establishment was in these wars among them for 40 years. And eventually Chavez just say like, well, I'm not from the establishment. I don't care about these two parties, because we used to have a bipartisan system in Venezuela before Chavez. He said, I'm not part of these guys, of the old people from always, the same politicians as always. So I'm the new guy. I'm going to do new stuff. And people, well, since they didn't trust anymore in the same political parties, they allow an outsider like him to come to power. Is that going to happen in the US? I don't know. I don't have the magic ball of the future. But if we allow that people don't trust institutions, don't trust democracy, don't trust the government, even though that the government in the US I think is huge, it should be smaller. But if people don't trust institutions, eventually someone is going to take advantage of that and is going to completely destroy the country, like it happened in Venezuela, and like it happens in every other country that a socialist character appears.
Mm-hmm. I love this next question. So, what has been the reception of your speeches on college campuses? What's been the reaction?
It's been great. I mean, when I have many anecdotes about the college campuses. I remember one in Massachusetts. There was this college kid that, after the presentation, he came to me and said, like, hey, I'm a Bernie supporter, and I came to your presentation because my best friend dragged me to, but I actually like what you said. So I'm going to make more research. So give me your phone number so we can, exchange opinions. And after a few days, he replied back to me saying, like, hey, I made a lot of research about what you said in the presentation, and I don't think I'm going to continue following Bernie. I think I'm going to with another option. I mean, that's just one example of other examples, but I always put that because I think that every single initiative that people is doing here in the US, as long as they start changing one mind after another people, you will have an actual change. And there is many other reactions. People, like you said, saying, well, that happened in Venezuela, but that will not happen here because in here we want to make the Nordic model, not the Venezuelan model. Or that happened in Venezuela because you have oil, we don't have the same amount, and X and Y. So me and Jorge in the project, we have to, discuss with these students and actually say what the Nordic model actually are and what is the difference with Venezuela, but always from a position of respect. I think that's something that I would always try to do in the presentations. I have had students saying that they see themselves as socialist libertarians. Only God knows what is that, but they say that they're socialist libertarians. And in the end, I try to respect them. Okay, well, tell me what is that? Define it. Let's talk about that. Let's hear what you think about that. So when you actually, try to, for a moment, try to put yourself in these people's position, you understand that many of them don't actually know what socialism is. So they see problems in the society in the US, and they think that the problems come from the capitalist system, which is not. It actually comes from too much government intervention in many aspects of US society. So it's just speaking with respect, trying to not come here like, I'm from Venezuela, so I know what socialism is, so everyone shut up. No, it's like, okay, let's discuss it, let's see what your opinion is, and let's try to reach an agreement. And we have, plenty of good reception from students, even if they don't agree with us.
Yeah. I'm going to jump around a little bit. So do you think that the interests of the three main global political actors, being Russia, China, and the US, are the reason why the situation remains stagnant in Venezuela?
Yes. There is many theories. There is people who say that, well, Russia has a lot of interest inside Venezuela, so they're going to do everything they can in order to, avoid Maduro to be overthrown, and the same goes with the China intervention. I think that that's not the actual case. Of course, Russia has money. We owe money to Russia, and we owe many more to the Chinese. But just like it happened in Bolivia, when Evo Morales was overthrown in Bolivia by this democratic movement. By the way, what happened in Bolivia was not a coup d'etat, it was actually constitutional. What happened in Bolivia, you saw that in the next week, Russia actually recognized the President Áñez, who took power of the executive in Bolivia. Well, Evo Morales used to be a huge ally of Russia, and they owe money to Russia. Why did Russia recognize her? Because they kept, they said to Russia, we're going to respect whatever agreements you used to have, and we're going to see a way to pay the debt. This guy from Russia and China, they only care about the money that they had invested in Venezuela. There are ways to find a way through that. In my personal opinion, I think that we shouldn't give anything to these people in money. If we owe money to Russia and China, that's their problem, by giving money to a dictatorship that is going violating human rights. That's not our problem. There's actually an economic theory of how you avoid the ownership of the money. But I think that the main reason why Maduro is still in power is because it's really complicated to enter Venezuela. I mean, this is not just a common thing. You have the FARC, you have the ELN, you have Hezbollah, you have the Cubans, which is our main problem in Venezuela, the Cubans. You have many aspects that is just like, we're going to overthrow Maduro. You have to overthrow the whole system. So I don't think it's something that is going to happen from one day to another. And I think that the US has done a lot to try to, reach to that point, but let's see what happens in the future.
Yeah. And I'll ask you just this one last question. So what things can we do to support freedom in Venezuela? Can we do?
Well, first, pray. That will be great for the people in Venezuela. Second, the story that I just told you, there is many other Venezuelans also here in the US and outside the US in many other countries telling the story, their testimony of what happened in Venezuela. If you know what is going on, you know the reality, how bad it is, you can spread that message. You don't have to be Venezuelan to do that. You can spread the message about the people you know, so that the US society actually understand how bad the situation is in Venezuela. A lot of politicians try to make the argument that what is going on in Venezuela is not that bad, the US shouldn't be helping Guaido, whatever. No, not only the US should be helping, everyone in the region should, because the Venezuelan problem is no longer an internal problem, it's a regional problem. The problem with the narcotics, the problem with the terrorism, the problem with the illegal operations, and the humanitarian crisis. No country on earth is ready to receive 6 million Venezuelans from one day to another. No one in Latin America is. So the regime is destabilizing the whole region. That's a problem for US national security. So that's something that US society should know. What is going on, how people is suffering, and the best way that as a society we can help our policymakers to try to make the right steps of how to approach democracy in Venezuela is so that the public view, the public opinion is, gathered around that option, around the option of doing something, not just staying out, doing something to help Venezuela, not just because of the crisis, but like I said, it's a bomb that eventually is going to blow up in the US border.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Your story deserves to be heard, and I'm so grateful to be able to host you tonight and allow everyone to get to hear from you. So thank you to everyone for joining. I'm happy to follow up with an email, and I can send this recording of this webinar and give you all the links so that you can follow Andrés and continue to follow his story and his activism, and then learn a little bit about the Atlas Society too. So thank you so much, and let's do this again.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining the webinar. I sorry that we hadn't had the chance to answer all the questions, but hey, you can send an email, you can find me on social media, you can tell Anna, we can be happy to answer that. So thanks again to Anna and to Atlas Society. This is a wonderful opportunity. I've been following Atlas Society for a while, so when I find out about the opportunity of joining and doing this, I was really excited. So thanks again everyone for joining. I hope that you go back to I was going to say to your houses, but you're already in your house probably. So you shut down your computer and you understand for now what reality is in Venezuela and how bad it is, and just encourage you to keep reading about what is going on. And thank you everyone again. Stay safe, and thank you, Anna.
Thank you. Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye.